NATO is preparing for war with China. At its annual summit last week in Washington, D.C., the alliance laid out its plans to pivot toward the Pacific. We'll discuss this and more on the China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of a country that we're taught to hate but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, and this is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Amanda.
Why don't you kick us off with the headlines?
President Donald Trump was nearly assassinated during a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Immediately after the shooting, the New York Post blamed a Chinese man for the assassination attempt. It quietly changed its article after the identity of the shooter became known, without issuing a formal correction. New York State Senator Ai Wen-chu and the Chinese Civic Organization Committee of 100 have demanded a formal apology for the New York Post for this false reporting. New York State Assemblywoman Grace Lee also called for an apology, saying, "Reckless, false reporting like this perpetuates hate and violence against Asians." The Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post has a long history of publishing sensationalist, false anti-China articles, a theme that is constant in his other media outlets, the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, the Australian, Sky News Australia, Fox News, and hundreds of other papers and outlets controlled by the media mogul's News Corp Corporation, where he's the chairman emeritus.
China blasts U.S.-Tibet China dispute bill, vows to defend its interests. On Friday, President Biden signed into law the Tibet Dispute Act, which gives recognition to the notion of Greater Tibet and pressures China to secure a negotiated agreement on the Himalayan region. Tibet is part of China, though this new law appears to put that position into question. China's foreign ministry has responded by stating that the law grossly interferes in China's domestic affairs, undermines China's interests, and sends a severely wrong signal to the Tibet independence forces. Such attempts will never succeed, the spokesperson continued, adding, "If the U.S. continues down the wrong path, China will take resolute measures to firmly defend its sovereignty, security, and development interests." In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA used feudal Tibetan theocratic elites to foment an armed secessionist uprising against the newly formed PRC, training thousands of guerrillas in Colorado and airlifting vast amounts of weapons and materials for war.
6,000 assembly workers of Samsung Electronics Union braved monsoon downpours last week to protest working conditions. The union has declared an indefinite strike, the first in the 63-year-old history of the company. Samsung Electronics, which manufactures chips, phones, and consumer electronics, is the flagship corporation of Samsung, one of the largest conglomerates in South Korea. Samsung was an integral part of the corporate military dictatorship alliance that developed South Korea, and the country is sometimes referred to as the Republic of Samsung. Samsung assembly workers, many of whom are women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, are striking for a wage increase and a defined bonus structure. Previously, workers for whom bonuses constitute up to half of their salaries, found that these bonuses were not tied to their own productivity, but rather to the market profitability of the division, something they have no control over. In the past year, Samsung saw losses of 80% in its memory chip division due to its being forced to comply with U.S. chip sanctions on China that were aimed to undermine China's tech industry. The company socialized these market losses due to its corporate policy, cutting expected bonuses from 50 to 100% of salary to 25, 12.5%, or even 0%. This year saw a rebound with AI market-boosted profits, and workers sought to recoup previous losses, demanding a salary increase and an end to the unfair bonus system. Korean corporations such as Samsung, SK Hynix, and Taiwan's TSMC are key players in the US's attempt to box out China technologically as the US escalates to war against China.
Cuba and China expand cooperation. Visiting Beijing this week, Cuban Deputy Prime Minister Jorge Luis Tapia noted the prospects to expand cooperation with China, specifically in the agricultural sector. The Deputy Prime Minister stated the new possibilities of Chinese training and technical assistance, obtaining seeds with highly productive potential, and accessing new technologies. Presidents Xi Jinping and Miguel Diaz-Canel have both identified the agri-food sector as a prioritized area to address Cuba's need for food sovereignty. Currently, the island nation imports 70% of its food. In Beijing, Tapia visited several poultry and pork companies and production centers, which are leaders in the application of science, innovation, automation, and biotechnology.
China's State Council passed new regulations on rare earths to improve the tracking and export of these rare earth elements. The implementation of the new regulations will deepen supply side reform, ensure the safety and stability of the strategic resource industry supply chain, allowing China to gain bargaining power in the unfair international high tech competition, according to a commentator in the Global Times. It is widely assumed that these new regulations will make it difficult for sanctioned US firms to access these metals from China. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies have been banned from buying China's rare earth metals and elements that are essential in creating the destructive technologies of these weapons manufacturers.
China sanctions 6 U.S. defense companies for Taiwan arms sales. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that it was sanctioning 6 American defense companies and their top executives for their involvement in a recent U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. The 6 companies in question are Anduril Industries, Maritime Tactical Systems, Pacific Rim Defense, Avex Aerospace, LKD Aerospace, and Summit Technologies. Their China-based assets will be frozen. According to the ministry's statement, these arms sales seriously violate the One China principle and interfere in China's internal affairs and undermine the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Chinese customs officers caught a man trying to smuggle 104 live snakes in his pants from Hong Kong into China, local media reported last Tuesday. The man attempted to pass through the customs at Shenzhen through the nothing to declare line. Upon inspection, Chinese customs officers found 6 plastic bags stuffed with milk snakes, Western hognose snakes, corn snakes, Texas rat snakes, and bull snakes. Certification is required to bring in snakes that are non-native to China into the country.
All right, and now to our main story. Last week, NATO held its annual summit in Washington, D.C., where representatives from the alliance met with partner countries and they discussed policy as well as the strategic direction of the alliance. Now, KJ, I don't know if you noticed this, but I found that a lot of the media focus during this time, it focused a lot on Biden's gaffes during the summit. For instance, Biden calling Ukraine President Zelensky Putin, Biden addressing Kamala Harris as Vice President Trump. And of course, that makes sense because these are the things that get clicks. But I found that it kind of overshadowed, like what was actually discussed at the summit, which is very, very alarming, right? What was actually discussed was like further militarization of the Pacific, driving us toward not only war with Russia and China, but closer to like nuclear war. And out of this summit, NATO released their Washington Summit Declaration, which outlines a lot of their political and military priorities for the upcoming year. So, KJ, I'm just curious, what were your key takeaways from this summit, from this declaration, and, just your overall thoughts of what transpired last week at the summit?
I think you're absolutely right, Amanda. There was a focus on the superficial optics of the summit rather than the actual agenda and the policies that came out of it. And if we look at the language of the Washington Summit Declaration, it is really quite chilling. Essentially, the declaration, which, of course, as to be expected, is full of mendacity. It claims that NATO is defensive, democratic, it upholds international law, which it is none of those things. It is an aggressive alliance. It is not democratic, certainly not in any meaningful sense. And it is a serial violator of international law, most notably in the multiple wars of aggression that it has waged. But one of the key things that I want to highlight is that, among other things, it declares that NATO will be coming into Asia, that it is essentially creating an alliance, an Asian NATO alliance, and that this will significantly escalate the risks of war. If you read the language, it is incredibly critical of China. They state that the People's Republic of China, China's stated ambitions and coercive policies continue to challenge our interests, security, and values. They are a cause for profound concern. And of course, they have blamed China for decisively enabling the war in Ukraine. All of these things are certifiably incorrect, but these assertions were put forth without any challenge in the media.
Yes. Ukraine and China were the main focuses of the declaration. In the declaration, it noted that, NATO and its allies, they're going to pledge, $40 billion or 40 billion euros, toward the war in Ukraine in the next year. And as you mentioned, NATO is pivoting toward the Pacific. It outlines that NATO will expand its so-called partnerships into the Indo-Pacific. In other words, increase the military encirclement of China, right? And they're seeking to institutionalize the partnership of what they call the Indo-Pacific Four, which includes Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, I believe. And it's also calling for enhancement of its anti-ballistic missile systems. It's calling for strengthening its nuclear capability. And it's, of course, inching us closer and closer to nuclear war.
Exactly. They're talking about enhancing NATO's deterrence and defense in all domains, in multiple strategic directions across the Euro-Atlantic area, as well as in Asia. They're talking about preparing for high intensity, multi-domain collective defense. They're talking about including decisive battle munitions, air and missile defense, air surveillance capacity. They're talking about moving, reinforcing, supplying, sustaining forces, etc. So this is very, very aggressive language. It really is preparation for war.
Yes, and another point that I think we should definitely discuss is that it called NATO, this declaration, it called China a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, right? And it issued the strongest indictment so far of China, and it accuses China of providing not necessarily providing weapons, but dual-use technologies. Dual-use technologies meaning chips, sensors, and other forms of technology that Russia can use in weaponry in its war in Ukraine. And, it's really important to note here that China is not providing weapons to Russia. And the NATO officials, they recognize this, they acknowledge this. Rob Bauer, who's the chair of NATO's military committee, is quoted in Foreign Policy shortly after the summit. He said, China's not giving weapons yet, but basically they give everything that makes a weapon. And therefore, they are complicit as well. So, like the outgoing NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, he claimed in a press conference last week that these components are being used to manufacture weapons for Russia. And of course, China hit back, and they were quoted as saying 72% of Russian-made weapons come from U.S. companies. How does the U.S. explain that? And so I read this quote, and I found it really remarkable. So I had to do some research on it. And it's actually true. They're not providing, the U.S. is not providing weapons necessarily, but a study released earlier this year found that despite Western sanctions, 95% of all components found in Russian weapons that were found on the battlefield, they came from producers in Western coalition countries, with 72% accounted for by U.S.-based companies alone. So while NATO and the U.S. accuse China of supplying Russia with these component parts, these dual-use technologies, in order to sustain the war in Ukraine, it's actually the U.S. doing this. And, we said this in last week's episode, and we always say this, but, every U.S. accusation against China is a confession. And this is just another example of that.
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, these war profiteers are making money coming and going. Certainly, if you want to accuse China of supplying components, you really have to acknowledge that it's the U.S. which is supplying the vast, majority of the components that are used in Russian weapons. And, the term dual use is really a misnomer. I have a pencil here. I can use it to write a love letter, or I can stab myself in the eye with it. Everything ultimately is dual use. But what they're doing is they're singling out China for something that the US itself is doing, and which most of the countries on the planet are doing. Most of the countries on the planet are engaging in normal trade with Russia. That's at least 140 countries that refuse to go along with US sanctions. And there's nothing in that which is specifically, quote unquote, decisively enabling war. But on the other hand, NATO and the US are not only responsible for supplying weapons, they're responsible for supplying information, they're supplying trainers, and they're also responsible for the escalation that triggered the war itself. So for the United States and NATO to somehow put the blame on China for the war or enabling the war is hypocrisy of just kind of mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing hypocrisy. And it reminds me, I'm sorry for the analogy, it reminds me there was in San Francisco in 2012, there was a cyclist. He ran through 3 or 4 red lights, and then he barreled into an intersection where people were crossing, and he killed one of the pedestrians. And after he did that, he said that it was the fault of somebody on the other side of the street who had gotten off the bus. This is similar to NATO. NATO has blasted through all of Russia's red lines. It's enabled, it's facilitated, it's triggered, it's supplying, it's enabling and maintaining the war. And somehow it feels the need to blame China, who is essentially a neutral party, who, as they assert, is not responsible, did not create the war, is not a party to the war. Extraordinary hypocrisy.
Extraordinary hypocrisy. And you mentioned this a few minutes ago, but I think it's really important to highlight, that NATO frames itself as a defensive alliance. If you read through this declaration, it almost feels like it's speaking in code, right? The language that it uses, it's a very aggressive policy. All these policies are really calling for more and more military buildup. It's driving us closer to nuclear war. It's driving us closer to a direct confrontation with Russia and China. But everything is couched in the language of defense and security and deterrence. And throughout the document, NATO, frames itself as a defensive alliance, which is really ridiculous. It's very backwards, where you read it and up seems like down, down seems like up. But NATO, of course, is not a defensive alliance. It's an imperialist offensive alliance. And if you look at its history, you would know that to be true. It started in the Soviet Union, or it started during the Cold War to thwart, influence of the Soviet Union. And then after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, it kind of...
Amanda, I disagree. I wouldn't say it was designed to thwart the Soviet Union. It was actually an aggressive alliance designed to ensure capitalism was successful in Europe and to prevent the rise of socialist movements. We can see that in movements like, Operation Gladio, the dirty wars, the terror against leftists. And we should also highlight that NATO preceded the Warsaw Pact. So it actually preceded any quote-unquote threat that the Soviet Union posed. In fact, good documentation from that period shows that the NATO leadership was very, very clear and aware that the Soviet Union did not have expansionist tendencies. And they went ahead and created this extraordinarily belligerent military alliance anyway.
Right. And, after the Cold War ended, NATO and the arms industry kind of work hand in hand, right? And so after the Cold War ended, these arms dealers there was no market for it anymore. And so they kind of drove NATO to adapt to drive the neocon agenda. And so it was these arms manufacturers that really lobbied Congress and Washington to push NATO eastward. And so pushing that eastward expansion was what created this lucrative market for the arms dealers, really. And so everything that NATO does is for the sake of these military contractors. And so the Washington Declaration, for example, it calls for a buildup of more anti-ballistic missiles in Poland and Romania, I believe. Well, who are the ones that make these missiles in the first place? It's Lockheed Martin, right? And so another thing that is highlighted in the declaration, which I didn't know and I found really shocking, was that it now requires the majority of NATO countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on so-called defense, right? And so Canada has been under a lot of pressure from NATO because they haven't been meeting that requirement. And I read this article in CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Company. It kind of talked about how Canada was not meeting this 2% GDP requirement. And in this article, NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, he scolded the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, over not meeting that requirement. And it said, Stoltenberg said he understood the political reflex to spend on health and infrastructure, but allies still need to prioritize defense investments. I mean, that's the craziest thing I've ever read, right? Here he is scolding the Prime Minister of Canada for spending too much on things like healthcare, doctors, bridges, roads, infrastructure. And not spending it on what's really important, which is, this upcoming military confrontation with China. And I think that quote really shows you where NATO's priorities are. And it's the same thing in the US, right? Here, infrastructure is crumbling. People are struggling to make rent. We're being pushed toward deeper and deeper austerity. But there's no money to address people's needs. There's no money to help people pay their rent, no money for childcare, but there's always more money for war. There's always more money to give to Israel to further its genocide in Gaza. There's always more money to Ukraine. So I think, it's an incredibly bonkers statement, but it really shows you where NATO's priorities lie.
Yeah, I think bonkers is an understatement here. I mean, absolutely, it is absurd from top to bottom. They talk about, preserving security and safety. I mean, as if infrastructure and social welfare is not necessary for the safety and security of a population. It's in fact the first priority if you really had quote unquote the values that NATO is uh, you know pompously postulating here. But I think you're absolutely right here. I think that this kind of extraordinary military expenditure. I mean, it's the guns and butter debate, right? I mean, if you spend on weapons of destruction, you do not have money to pay for the necessary social necessities to maintain a sane and functioning society. Now, already, even before these increases, the United States by itself spends more on its military than 190 countries combined. The US by itself spends more than 190 countries combined. But if you add the US military budget plus the NATO budget, essentially you have something which is such a monstrously asymmetric, over uh, overfunding, bloated monstrosity that it just really tells us, what the values of this organization is. Essentially, it is the military arm of U.S. imperialism and U.S. capitalism, and it is sending the clear message that it is determined to continue war in Ukraine and escalate to kinetic war against China. And that's a very, very frightening thing. The other thing I'll say is, you mentioned earlier about nuclear threats. If you read Article 9, which is on their nuclear, quote, deterrence policy, they talk about modernizing nuclear capabilities, strengthening nuclear capacity and planning, taking all necessary steps. They highlight that they are a nuclear alliance and that they are committed to ensuring that strategic stability and collective security. I mean, this is very, very threatening language. They say that their posture is based on an appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities, complemented by space and cyber capabilities, etc. Uh, all of this points out that we're in this situation of extraordinarily heightened hostility and militarization, and I think I think it's very important for us to draw attention to this.
Absolutely. It's a dangerous escalation a dangerous period that we're heading into. And as they say, there's always money for war, but not the poor. I think that's all the time that we have. KJ, why don't you close us out?
Yes. So there has been um, Richie Torres, who has been calling Medea Benjamin of Code Pink a CCP hack and apologist for Hamas. And I think this is quite extraordinary because Medea Benjamin, who is an activist with the peace organization Code Pink, has been calling him out for enabling the genocide. And his only response, because he can't respond to any of the facts that she's presenting him with, is to call her names, to call her a CCP hack, and to call her, an agent of Hamas. I mean, this is the level at which our quote unquote elected leadership are functioning. I think the other piece, which is important, is that she mentions the Hannibal Directive. I'm sure you're aware of that, Amanda.
Yeah, let's go ahead and roll the clip because this video is really incredible.
Because
the
of
Hannibal
Hamas.
directive of Israel killing its
Because
own
of Hamas.
people. How do you feel about
But
the
you
Hannibal
are a supporter of
directive?
Hamas. You do the bidding of the
You're
CCP, the bidding of
public
Russia,
official.
of Hezbollah,
You're
of
supposed
Hamas.
to answer questions. Do you support the Hannibal directive?
I am not accountable to hacks
Do you
of the
support
Chinese Communist Party.
Israel
So
killing its own people like they did on October 7th?
you are Hamas murdered Israelis.
And
Thousands of Israelis murdered, maimed, tortured.
That they used the Hannibal directive, which meant
are,
they could kill their own
you are
people.
dangerously delusional.
You don't even believe
and you're
that.
promoting the propaganda of Hamas. And you should be ashamed of
The
yourself.
propaganda of Hamas that's been said by Netanyahu himself, admitted.
You are a disgrace.
Do you listen to what Netanyahu himself
No, I listen
says
to the truth and to the facts.
admits?
And the facts tell us that Hamas is a terrorist group.
You are a tool of AIPAC, that's all you are.
Do you have a problem with genocide? Do you have an issue with 500-pound bombs being dropped on children? What are you, a CCP puppet? That's basically what he's saying.
Yeah, and notice he says that he listens to truth and facts, but media is actually giving him the facts. I mean, this is now well reported. Haaretz reported that the Hannibal directive, which is this directive to kill civilians if there is a risk of hostages, was actually implemented in the first hours of October 7th. I mean, this has been well established. It's reported in the Israeli news, and he's refusing to listen to facts, to truth, and simply tarring her and insulting her. I mean, I think I'm just, kind of astonished that this is the level at which our quote unquote leadership functions.
All right, that's all the time that we have for. See you next week on the China Report.